she had said that really having a sense of purpose is the most important thing that she can bring to bear in a nonprofit. And she, I think, meant especially because you can't necessarily pay people as much as you would like or as much as you would if you were in a for-profit enterprise. So in a way, the importance of purpose is even more essential than in other situations.
Step into the world of success with Your Brand Amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. I am thrilled to have Ken Banta on the show today. You are the founder and CEO of the Vanguard Network, and you're doing a lot to help the next generation of leaders and current leaders become better at what we do. So Ken, thank you first and foremost for being on Your Brand Amplified.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
And I'd love to hear a little bit about your background I know about your background because I obviously have all the information, but for the audience, what does your background look like that led you into leadership and then into realizing you had another career, another calling?
Well, I guess I started out initially growing up in the U.S. and in Europe. So I was born in Germany, but then grew up in the U.S. as well as in Frankfurt and in Milan, Italy. And then after college, I went to work with Time magazine. So that was a very interesting episode. I think in hindsight, it gave me a lot of ability to digest things quickly and to get to the heart of the matter. It probably wasn't a particularly strong education in leadership because there are leaders, of course, in a certain way in journalism, but very often the role is more to analyze things than necessarily to make a decision. So I think, though, that the analysis piece of it was very valuable, and also just the diversity of experiences, because a large part of my time, Time magazine was spent in Eastern Europe covering the fall of communism and the rise of democracy. And so I saw a lot of leadership, good and bad, in that time. And I think that really helped me as I went on. After that, I worked in consulting for a while in public affairs. And then I got recruited into a very big company that was in a lot of trouble, which was Pharmacy and Upjohn. It was the old Upjohn company of the US and Pharmacy of Sweden. And the merger started out really badly and probably could have failed. But I was lucky to work with a CEO and eventually a broader team that really delivered a remarkable turnaround there. And after several acquisitions and mergers within that combination, I went on to Schering-Plough, which was another train wreck of a company where we did, again, a number of deals. And then finally at Bausch & Lomb, which was maybe not a train wreck, but a company in real trouble, a great brand, but fallen on hard times. And so we were very successful in turning that around. And at the end of all that, several people said, well, why don't you take some of the things you learned about leadership and transformation and apply them more widely? So that's how we created the place I run today, which is the Vanguard Network. And
your story is so interesting and engaging because I can see that as you're talking about your work at Time, obviously being international, being able to think in different languages and see different perspectives, I'm sure has not only shaped your career as a journalist, but then also in corporate strategic affairs, in turnarounds, mergers, acquisitions, and in all of the different things that you've done, because you were able to bring your own perspective, but also see other people's perspectives.
Yeah, I think that might well be right. And sometimes, when you're in the middle of it, you don't notice these things, but I think that's probably true in hindsight. And with Vanguard, where I am today and for the last 10 years or so, we've really focused on two areas. And one of them is creating networks of leaders in different areas, including life sciences and also general counsels across industries, which is sometimes not a very well understood role, but general counsels more and more are kind of at the center of companies because everybody needs their advice or they need their guidance. And so they are involved in internal things and external things. They're often acting as the intermediary with the board and the CEO. So they play a very important, complicated role. And then, of course, CEOs in life sciences companies, the proverbial buck stops there. So we have an interesting mix of members, and those individuals mainly come together in both face-to-face and virtual sessions where we have a kind of motto of no podium and no PowerPoint, which I think is, very welcome, but also really important because it helps to generate a real, I'd say, peer-to-peer interaction among people versus a lecture type feeling. And that's something that's relatively rare and very important to people at that kind of senior level. And then we also do a lot of consulting or advisory work in the same vein with similar types of people. Sometimes they're members of the organization, but sometimes they're not. But it's things like how to think about how to run your own company or entity better, how to be a better leader yourself, how to align your top team if it's not aligned. It's those kinds of, again, kind of leadership centered things. We don't do stuff like Salesforce training or layering or other things that a lot of big consultancies do. Those are probably very important things, but we just don't do them. We do things that are very centered on the leadership dimension of the job.
Yeah. And I think that's a unique perspective again. And it's also one that we need. We need strong leaders. We need leaders who are paying attention and who understand what it means to truly lead an organization. It doesn't matter what time it is, but looking at the time we're living in right now with tariffs, and thinking about different events and how they're affecting healthcare, pharma. When we look at AI, how that's affecting the work that general counsels do as well. And when we're looking at really big changes in the world of work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, first of all, the role of leadership has, there's probably been times in history when it's been just as complicated because we often forget that, there have been periods like the plague during the Middle Ages. There have been periods during the Cold War. There have been World War II and, going back in history, Alexander invading Persia. I mean, I think in their own ways, those were incredibly tumultuous, complicated times. But, this period certainly is unique in the kind of complexity that's going on of both technology and change in the environment. So yeah, I think it does take really very wide bandwidth for leaders to be successful. And, it's often assumed that that leadership is synonymous with good leadership, but I don't necessarily think so. I think you can have very effective leaders who are really bad for society. And if you look back in time to someone like Hitler, I don't think anyone would disagree that he was very effective as a leader, but I don't think there's too many people who think he was really good for the world either. So you want to combine great leadership with a great kind of moral compass, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, everything you're talking about is a disruption. Right. And that is an area that you're very comfortable and all the things that you've done, not just these world top history that you've been talking about, but also everything that you've done in your career, being there when communism was falling in Eastern Europe, helping with all of these mergers and, disruptions in different industries and different organizations that you've been part of. And that's one of the things that you can really focus on with these leaders, whether it is today and we're looking at these other kinds of disruptions, or they have, I don't want to call it simpler disruptions, but things like, okay, maybe we need to merge with another organization, or we need to look at, we're trying to roll out a new product line and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that these capabilities today for leading through disruption, which I think include, real agility and also real sensing mechanism for what's going on and how to respond quickly to it. I think those things are important for leaders of big organizations, but I think they're also, very important to people who are working at other levels in companies or in very small organizations. The person who leads a team of salespeople in the field needs these same capabilities and will benefit from them just as much as the CEO of that company. And so I think a lot of the kind of the valuable capabilities for disruptive environments are valuable, from top to bottom in organizations and in life, really.
What are some of the ways that leaders at any level, as you mentioned, should approach leading in times of disruption?
Well, it's really interesting. The book that I recently put together of Seeing Around Corners captures a lot of perspectives on that front from leaders who are either members of our networks or are advisors to us in some way. And I think that, there are a number of, I'd say, sort of themes that come through. And one of them is certainly the ability to adapt quickly to change. And being able to do that means having an ability to sense very quickly what's happening around you. And also in larger organizations or even smaller ones, having an ability to reach out to people who are close to the action and hear from them what's happening. So, for example, if you are in fact the head of a sales team in, let's say, in Minnesota, one way to do that role is to be relatively distant and to wait for people to tell you how things are going. Another way to go, though, is to actively ask the people who work for you what's happening, to hear about what customers are saying today, and then to be ready to mid-course correct about what you're doing or how you're operating. And I think today that latter approach of being highly, adaptive and highly in tune with what's going on is really essential for success.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one thing to be close to a few people and get information from them anecdotally. And perhaps then you also have data, hopefully, to back up some of the anecdotes. But then getting a sense of the pulse of the entire organization and seeing what kind of culture you may have bred, even if you didn't realize you were. What are some ways we could do that, I guess?
Well, I think the bigger the place, the harder it is, but the more important it is as well, because if you're in the middle of that organization or at the top of it, it's really quite critical to understand what's happening in the real working level where things actually get done. And, there is a tendency for people at middle and higher levels to distance themselves from what's happening at that, what you might call the frontline level. But that's, I think, a very dangerous mistake. And so, there are different ways to stay connected. I mean, one is, digitally now you can, ask for feedback from people in the field. And, if they trust you and believe that you'll actually use that in a smart way, then I think that can be a very, very powerful tool. That might be an internal, kind of feedback loop, or it might be some form of even AI-driven resource these days. You wouldn't be using AI for its own sake, but as a tool to perhaps amalgamate points of view. In some cases, you can also, using AI in a proper way, you can monitor chat rooms and other things, not to eavesdrop on people, but to get a kind of read on where things are going. Are people generally, happy with the way things are progressing, or are they unhappy? Are there disruptive elements they're facing? But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is still face-to-face discussion with people. And so even in a very big organization, it's important for the CEO or leader to arrange frequent roundtables or other types of discussion with the people at the working level, but to do it in a way that's not the wrong kind of discussion. And the wrong kind of discussion, I think, is where it's seen as just a Q&A forum, or I'm here to tell you all about how things are going and I'll take a few questions. But I think, the much more effective approach is very active engagement, where you're asking those people to tell you what's working well, but also what's not working well in the organization, perhaps even to raise issues with vital things that are part of the supply chain or something else where there's a problem or where they're seeing issues. Mary Barrett, GM, I think, is often cited, I think, as someone who does that really well by going right to the people who do the work and engaging about, not what they think about things only, but about what needs fixing. And then, how should we go about solving that problem? And that's a very different conversation than somebody who comes in and says, well, I'm here to tell you all about what I think about where we are, and then take a few questions and go away. So I think how you handle those face-to-face discussions is really important. But if you do it well, then not only do you learn a lot from it, but the word of mouth is terrific, because of course everybody who was in that room is going to tell everyone they work with, how well it went. Hopefully, they'll also tell them how badly it went if it didn't.
This is very true, and I think this is a really face-to-face time. It's something that we don't get a lot of these days. I mean, you and I are here on Riverside having this conversation because we're on different coasts right now. If I were in New York, perhaps we could have done this in a studio and met in person, right? And it's something, I think, with companies being somewhat fractured these days. Some have return to office policies, some have multiple offices all over. It can be difficult. But what you're saying is that it really is worth the time and intentionality to have these conversations where you are making everybody feel like they are part of the culture, that their voice is important in your organization, so that you can get constructive criticism, feedback, without getting defensive as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, when we think of face-to-face, I think sometimes virtual is pretty good for that. I mean, it may not be perfect, but, you can have a good conversation with 5 or 6 people now on Zoom, especially if you're really comfortable in how to use it. So I think it's a good substitute for face-to-face. For example, if you're, in, let's say, in New York and the team is in China, it's difficult to find a lot of opportunities to meet with them there. But, you might use Zoom as a way to do that or as a substitute. And I think, again, it takes a certain amount of skill to do so, but I think it can be done.
Okay, fantastic. When you decided to start the Vanguard Network, what were those early days like 10 years ago, looking back, or over 11 years ago now? Did you have the vision as it is now? Was it difficult to get the first people in?
Oh, that's a good question. Very good question. We started out really coming out of the ecosystem I knew, which was the health and pharma areas. So our initial groups were pharmaceutical or healthcare executives. As we went along, and it went quite well, and for a while we actually had a circle in Europe as well as in the US. However, what we found was that it was a little diffuse. We were talking about people across healthcare. And I think that while there are linkages across the different parts of the healthcare ecosystem, there's also a lot of differences. And so, for example, executives in very large companies are very different in terms of what they need, obviously from people in smaller ones. And so anyway, it became more clear to us that we probably needed to be more focused on certain subsectors. And pretty much at that same time, several people pointed out that, we could really do a very effective job with general counsel, not just in healthcare, but across industries and across geographies. And that actually came through a few GCs that I'd worked with in those prior lives. But I think they had a really great point, and it turned out to be validated that the GC community, if you like, didn't have a lot of opportunities for face-to-face, peer-to-peer conversations, but they really were very eager to do so. And so I think we were an answer to an existing need. And we didn't exit the life sciences area, but we focused much more on life sciences CEOs, which are a sort of a group that are, especially ones based in the Boston, Cambridge area in the US, who are ones who are the real CEOs of innovator companies. They're not out there selling and marketing products, which is an important thing to do, but that's not what they do. They're really creating the new stuff. And that's a very exciting crowd. And again, we kind of zeroed in on that group because we realized, and I think we were right, that they were sort of underserved for this kind of conversation about leadership. Also with CEOs of life sciences companies, it's not always the case, but it's often the case that they come from a science background and from science careers. And those types of careers and backgrounds don't always generate, sort of intuitive good leadership. They might be very science focused versus people focused or leadership of people focused. So there's a lot of things that they can build on. And I think that group that we have values the Vanguard Network for that reason.
I think that is a really important distinction. Speaking about people, I think about my daughter she's going to get her PhD in neuroscience. And I think about what she would be like as a leader versus somebody who comes from a different background, maybe a pure business background. And so I appreciate that you're able to offer that level of service and value. How do you decide who gets to be a member in the organization? What's the vetting process, if you will?
Pretty simple, really. I mean, with the kinds of roles that we're looking at, it's kind of self-selecting. So if you're a CEO of a reasonable sized biopharma company, then you're a good person for the network. And general counsel generally only exist in companies that are pretty large. So generally speaking, if they're a GC, then they're a good person to be part of the network. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, but that's really how we look at it. It'd be different if we were, and in fact, we have run in the past a program for new leaders, and we may start that again, which is really aimed at people who are early in their career. That's a little different story. I think there we did need to know a bit about why they would be good candidates for the program, and in some cases needed to be endorsed by somebody who would nominate them to be in the program. Actually, there's a parallel there too in our current programming. We do have a program for what we call Next Generation General Counsel. It's a program for preparing people for the move from being a senior person in a law department, which is just a very different role than being a general counsel. And usually that jump is very hard and arduous. And a lot of times people fail simply because they haven't been adequately prepared for what they need to be ready to do. One example being that if you want to be a general counsel, it's not enough to have your own general counsel want you to take on that role. You need to often have the board and the CEO and others agreeing to that. So that's often a surprise. So this program helps people with that challenge. And that does require that the person who would be joining the program has to be recommended by their general counsel for it. So it's an example of something we do where you actually do need to be recommended or endorsed.
That's wonderful. And I also love that you talked about new leaders because that was going to be one of my questions. There's so much need for this kind of community connection, networking, and ability to learn from each other and from you and your team for every level of business, small businesses, medium size, right? Different industries. So was that part of the impetus behind writing the book, Seeing Around Corners?
Yeah, I think that the reason for putting that together was really to hopefully have insights for people in all kinds of organizations, and not even necessarily businesses, but people who are running not-for-profits or social organizations, and things that are impactful in communities, because a lot of the lessons that I think we hear in the book from generally quite accomplished senior leaders are mainly applicable to everybody. And I have a godson who is living in Cambridge, England, who works in construction. And he told me a hilarious but telling story about how he was taking a look at this book, and a bunch of his colleagues came around to ask what he was reading, and the foreman stopped by. And so by the end of it, they were all taking a look at some of the lessons or insights, and I think they found some of it was really applicable to what they do. So that's a great example, I think, of what we were hoping it would do, which is to be of value to people who are not necessarily CEOs.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And to provide that value, you have a lot of different stories from different people who are part of your network. Was there one story that was particularly surprising to you?
I think one of the more, maybe not surprising, but impactful ones was a anecdote in there by Roseanne Haggerty, who leads a group called Community Solutions. It's a nonprofit that I used to be a board member of, and I still advise. And it focuses on homelessness and solutions. So, and not really solutions in the sense of warehousing things, but figuring out how to end homelessness in cities and towns. Anyway, she had said that really having a sense of purpose is the most important thing that she can bring to bear in a nonprofit. And she, I think, meant especially because you can't necessarily pay people as much as you would like, or as much as you would if you were in a for-profit enterprise. So in a way, the importance of purpose is even more essential than in other situations. And I think she also, maybe not in the book, but to me has also commented about the importance of purpose to people who are Gen Zs, who are, perhaps not really any different from anyone else at that age, but very much driven by, or judgmental really, about whether an organization does have a proper sense of purpose and whether they buy into it. And so I think she has a certain number of people like that in her organization. So I think they probably find that the community solutions focus on purpose is actually very important to the reason why they're there.
Yeah, that is a great lesson for so many people. When we see on my side, marketing, comms, right, that connection to purpose, vision, the transparency and authenticity that consumers demand from brands, whether it is a pharma brand or biomedical brand or the shoe company that they love to support, has become so vitally important. And I wonder if part of that is, yes, because we want to support brands that have our values, but also the humanness, that human aspect when we live in a very tech-centered world that's becoming even more so.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me too. The challenge, though, is for organizations to really mean it. I think, there's a lot of examples of brands that are not really, they're not being lived, if you like, by the organization. And that's either because it's really not quite the right brand for what they do. I mean, if they're I think, if they're a company that, produces insurance premiums, to be saying that they are there to provide a sense of hope for people is a bit of a stretch. But to say that they're providing a really valuable service to people's daily life, okay, that starts to make sense. So I think sometimes these, branding is really disconnected from the reality of what the organization does, or the brand is could be relevant, but they're not living up to it, and that's also a obvious problem. But I think for both reasons, the idea of human contact and human relevance is what everyone's seeking. I think, though, again, it's back to that question: are you really delivering it?
Yeah. And I imagine that's one thing that you help it's not just a philosophical question, right? It's a real question also. And I imagine that's one thing that your groups and your coaching that you can help figure out, that your clients can kind of have those aha moments.
Yeah, I think on a good day, that's for sure the case. In probably the place where it maybe is most visible is when we get involved in organizational change, which we do from time to time. And in those situations, it's great to have the basic brand values and the proposition of the organization, which is the starting point. But then, how do you get that to really happen throughout the organization and reach people at the working level and have people really understand and feel that they're part of it and that what they're doing is actually relevant. That takes a certain amount of work, and so that's an area that we find really valuable and important, also rewarding, because if you can do that, you're really helping an organization to be very effective, but you're also helping the people within it to feel that they're actually meaningful.
What do you see as the next step for you in your journey and for the Vanguard Network?
Well, I think that we'll perhaps broaden a bit to other sectors or into other roles in organizations. We've talked a good deal about heading back to this concept of new leaders that we started a few years ago, but we just didn't have the bandwidth to address. So we would, I think, find it really interesting to head back to that group of future leaders, which would be this, perhaps people in their 20s to 30s. And so that would be really interesting. The other area that we might expand into is geographically. We're really focused on the U.S. and really only certain parts of the U.S. So we've got an interest in reaching out to the West Coast, where we're not really present, and also into not all over the world, but potentially in Europe, where we also have a few sort of existing kind of activities, but where we could grow them. So those are a few ideas anyway.
Yeah, that's quite a lot, but I am sure that the demand is there. I actually know a couple of life sciences organizations out here that I'd be happy to introduce you to.
Well, thank you. I'd be fascinated. Let's do that.
Yeah, fantastic. And how has the book been received? Have you reached your goals? If you had any specific goals in mind when you decided to.
I think it's been quite effective in with our own members. So we've circulated it pretty widely among our membership, and I think people find it valuable because, for one thing, they don't need to read the whole thing at one time. They can pick up nuggets because, as you know, it's sort of 80 different contributors with a couple pages each, and so we've distilled their thinking on a particular topic down, and that actually makes it quite easy for someone to go through that and find something that's relevant to them versus read the entire thing at once. So our members are one group that have found it valuable. And then we've also circulated a lot with some of our own advisors who find it useful. And then I know there's a good number of people who have come by, who have actually purchased it and been using it. I think that's really rewarding as well.
Do you see a part 2, 3, 4?
Well, I'm actually working on a very different book at the moment that is more really something where I'm generating the content versus kind of consolidating it. And the working concept is around the ability to adapt. And that's always been important. And in fact, I think the book is going to illustrate how that goes back to, the early periods of history. That adaptability has always been a big deal. But we're hoping to show that it's really important today, and also that all the different factors that are influencing us today, including new technologies and other things, are calling for a particular kind of adaptability that is maybe not new, but different anyway. So that's the idea. So that's what I'm working on currently, and I'm not quite sure when that's going to be done, but we're getting close to having the concept developed.
Fantastic. And love to have you back on when that book is ready to be launched into the world. And also we'll be able to get an update on the Vanguard Network and how your expansion plans have gone.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Is there one piece of advice that you would offer right now to those new leaders who are listening, or people who are in mid-tier leadership or management and aspire to be leaders of their organizations?
Well, I think that maybe a very important thing is something we talked about earlier, which is that I think really good leaders are really paying a lot of attention to the people around them and are technically in an organizational structure, below them in a certain sense, not in terms of quality, but in terms of management. And I think that really good leaders are always paying attention to what those individuals are saying, and also that they have the ability as leaders to ask for feedback about how they're doing and whether they're tuning in properly, whether they are on top of current trends. I think, very often people have a view of leadership as a kind of top-down type of activity, but the really good leaders that I've seen are ones who are much more leadership through influence, and leadership through influence means being able to lead often by asking questions versus telling people what to do. And that's, I think, another thing that would be a good thing to bear in mind for people who are aspiring to be leading either large organizations or having a more important leadership role.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And that this is definitely an episode that I'll have my digital leadership students listen to at USC. I always love introducing them to different people speaking about leadership and the kinds of, and emphasizing things that we talk about in class. And Ken, do you have a favorite quote, mantra, verse, family poem, motto?
Well, let's see. I think not really something that I've generated myself, but I was just reflecting on someone I know who is a pretty important leader in the health world, who runs the global dimension of Merck Sharp and Dohme, which is the global part of Merck, the health company, named Joe Romanelli. And he was running a meeting for his direct reports, actually all of his country leaders, which is more than direct reports, so 80 people or so, a year or two ago. And the purpose was really to help develop a even greater network among those individuals and a shared leadership approach. And he gave examples of where he hadn't really done as well as he wanted to in various situations. And in one case, he had been thinking of giving a speech about his new role. I think it was running China for them, the China operations. And he had a speech prepared, and he tried it out on some people in Europe, I think some of his peers, and he thought it was a great speech. And one of them came up to him and said, "That is really terrible. You probably want to not even, you want to tear it up and start over again." And the reason was that he was told that he actually sounded very pompous and self-impressed, and was already developing strategies for China before he'd even gotten there. So what he thought was a real leadership speech was coming across in a very bad way. So he did tear it up. And his message to the people then at this meeting much later, the one where he was now the head of the global operations, was, "I learned to just be myself." And I think that's actually a very good piece of advice, meaning trust your own instincts. Don't operate as if you're wearing a certain role around you, but be the person that you would want to be with people, and then you'll be very influential with everyone else. So just be yourself.
What a great story, and a great lesson in cultural sensitivities, cultural differences and approaches to business, and actually listening versus just speaking.
Exactly. There were lots of layers to what he was saying. And part of it was also a message to many of the people in the room who probably were a bit pompous and sort of very impressed with this. So it was taking, the message was that I'm expecting you to be yourself as well.
Very nice. Well, Ken, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. We, of course, will link to your show notes and to the Vanguard Network so that everybody has the ability to find your book really easily, to learn more about everything that you do. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. Once your next book is ready, I'm looking forward to reading that and learning about how we can continue to be better leaders, create really great cultures at our businesses, think about being adaptable and agile, and in a time when there's always going to be change. I don't think we're going to have a steady period for a long time with all of the disruptions that we have right now with tech and different aspects that are pushing and pulling against what the employee experience can be and what our experiences as leaders can be. So the work that you're doing is very much needed, whether it's somebody in those industries that you work in right now or in other industries. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks again for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you to everybody who's watching this episode or listening to it. I am looking forward to hearing from you on what you think after you've picked up Ken's book, the compilation of 80 different CEOs, founders, leaders, and the great advice that they have to distill to you. In the meantime, think about your own leadership journey. Think about where you want to be, how you show up, and are there tweaks that you can make right now? I'll look forward to having you all back for another episode. Thank you again for listening. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.